This is the Retro XP Podcast, a podcast dedicated to retro video games from the first and second gen with the Odyssey and the Atari 2600, all the way up to Gen 7 with the Xbox 360 and the PS3. On today's episode, we'll be going back, way back in history. And I'll be talking about some of the earliest video games in history, and I'm going to go back further than the Magnavox Odyssey days. We've come a long way since then, and while we're in kind of a contentious era of video game history today, we have to remember our roots, where we came from, and remember those who dared to create. All right, let's get started. What we know as video game history generally starts in the late 70s when we started to get arcades sweeping across the nation, home consoles coming into our homes as well. And that was when video games really hit the mainstream, when it wasn't really called video games at this time. It was like kind of called electronic games or electronic entertainment or something like that. But nonetheless, there was a lot of creative inventions taken as early as the 1950s. When computer technology started to kind of hit the ground running. And the first unofficial video game, and I say unofficial because it's not necessarily defined as one, the first unofficial game was created in 1947, technically, with what was called the cathode ray tube amusement device. And it wasn't official by the means that it was not sold to the public. It was not mass produced. It wasn't even like displayed at any conventions or any sort of presentations or anything. According to the U.S. Patent Office, though, it was a patented invention from 1947. Despite that, and it was invented by an American television pioneer, Thomas T. Goldsmith of Cedar Grove, New Jersey, and Estelle Ray Mann constructed the game from analog electronics and this cathode ray tube, which we know as kind of like a modern CRT TV. The patented application is dated as January 25th. So this is pretty much the earliest we can go back in terms of, electronic games at this point. And while it doesn't have an official name, it's basically describes a game of skill in which a player sits or stands facing a cathode ray tube video screen mounted in a cabinet. And the creators had designed the game to resemble a World War II radar display, but with airplanes or some other targets painted onto a transparent overlay. And this invention preceded the era of computer graphics, so it wasn't really like you could design an airplane or you could design a background or anything else in it. It was just basically blips and lights and, little things on the screen. So as far as control goes, the player turns a control knob to position the CRT beam on the screen. So it's a beam, so to speak. To the player, the beam appears as a dot, which represents a reticle, or kind of like a scope. So this is your target reticule. The player has a restricted amount of time in which to maneuver the dot so that it overlaps an airplane, and then to fire at the airplane by pressing a button. If the beam falls within the pre-programmed coordinates of a target when the user presses the button, then the CRT beam defocuses, which simulates an explosion. And basically, I don't think it was anything difficult. I think it was just an activity that you could do. It's the earliest patent for a video game, like I said, never officially produced. And oddly enough, it's not technically considered a part of video game history, which is kind of sad. And we get into the intricacies of what is technically considered a video game in this topic, because while there was ideas that were placed out there in terms of, hey, this was the impetus of this video game, or this was the impetus of that video game, it's not necessarily considered a video game. So it's just really weird. But nonetheless, I think this invention got the gears turning for a lot of people later on. And later on, a few years later, we got Birdie the Brain. And this could be argued as one of the first video games developed ever. And it was built in Toronto, Canada, by Dr. Joseph Cates for the 1950 Canadian National Exhibition. And this was a 13-foot tall computer. And it allowed exhibition attendees to play a game of tic-tac-toe against an algorithm presented by its creators as, quote, artificial intelligence. The player entered a move on a keypad in the form of a 3x3 grid, just like tic-tac-toe, or noughts and crosses, depending on where you're from. And the game played out on a grid of lights overhead. Not necessarily a monitor, but like lights, so to speak. The machine actually had an adjustable difficulty level. After 2 weeks on display by Rogers Majestic, the company that made it, the machine was disassembled at the end of the exhibition and largely forgotten as a curiosity. It was like a kind of fun little thing you can go up and play and check it out, and then that was it. They just dismantled it, and that was it. With this game, he designed what was called an Adatron tube, and this is similar in style to a vacuum tube, but smaller. And I would go through what the differences between a vacuum tube and an Adatron tube is. I think I'd make my head explode and probably make myself look stupid as hell trying to explain it. And so if you've seen the inside of an arcade monitor or a CRT TV, you might have seen what these kind of tubes look like. They look like large light bulbs, those old school incandescent light bulbs that, you remember from way back when. And they get very hot, and I know that they are very finicky. They can kind of break. The filaments inside these tubes can break finicky, but they're meant to be replaced. And that's the best way I can explain it to you. I don't know. If you are curious, pretty sure you can look it up. So, after Bernie the Brain's unsuccessful attempt to get patented and mass produced, this was likely due to Dr. Cates. He's just too busy. He was kind of had other projects, and this was kind of a fun thing he did just to kind of showcase, hey, this is what you can do with computers and algorithms or what they called artificial intelligence at the time. He kind of wasn't really interested in pursuing it anymore. I know a lot of companies maybe tried to kind of get him to maybe do something with it, and he was just like, whatever. Later on, we got Nimrod in 1951. And this was built by a company called Ferranti in the United Kingdom in 1951 for the 51 Festival of Britain. And this was a 12 by 9 by 5 foot computer. This was designed by John Makepeace Bennett. That is a very British name. And built by engineer Raymond Stewart Williams, and allowed exhibition attendees to play a game of NIM against an artificial intelligence. Again, they use the word artificial intelligence, but I would say how we define artificial intelligence now, maybe this is more computer algorithms instead of like what we know as artificial intelligence, where it can act independently and learn, so to speak, which I don't know. I think maybe the definition of artificial intelligence has kind of, formed into many different facets over time, but that's a whole nother topic. I don't feel like getting into that. So NIM is actually a mathematical combination type game in which two players take turns removing, or this is what they call nimming, objects from distinct heaps or piles. So on each turn, a player must remove at least one object and may remove any number of objects provided they all come from the same heap or pile. And this is like, I've seen this kind of played with matches, so to speak, where they line them up on a table, a flat table or something like that, into like pyramids or grids or something like that. And depending on the version of NIM that you're playing, the goal of the game is to either avoid taking the last object or to take the last object. I guess it depends on what type of game you're playing. So in the computer version of this, the player pressed buttons on a raised panel corresponding with lights on the machine to select their moves. So there was no monitor, so to speak. It was just lights on a board. And then after you made your move, the Nimrod moved afterward with its calculations represented by more lights. The speed of the Nimrod's calculations could be reduced to allow the presenter to demonstrate exactly what the computer was doing, with more lights showing the state of the calculations, I guess. This was the Nimrod was designed to kind of like showcase the programming skills of this computer. It wasn't supposed to be used as like an entertainment device, though the festival attendees were more interested in playing the game than the logic behind it, which is kind of interesting because it's like, hey, this is kind of a neat idea, but also this is fun to play. It was kind of like Oregon Trail when that came out on the Apple II computers way back when. It was supposed to be designed as like an educational device, teaching you about, the plight of people traveling to Oregon, in the 1800s, but it was a fun game, nonetheless, that we all like to play. So after its initial exhibition, at this time. The Nimrod was shown for 3 weeks in October 1951 as well at the Berlin Industrial Show. And then after that, it was dismantled again. So it was like kind of a neat idea, but we're moving on. So I don't think the idea of video games or like electronic entertainment was really a thing at this time. Obviously, computers, TVs, monitors were pretty new at this time. So I think the concept where you can actually use a computer and play a game on it was very, very foreign, very much maybe not even considered an idea that even could be done at this time. But it would, nonetheless, you can almost make a game out of anything. And like I said, they weren't called video games. They were called simulations. And were considered showpieces for what they called artificial intelligence at the time. And, even though we were still hitting the mainstream at the time with computers, and it would be decades before we get these computers into our homes, big corporations were foaming at the mouth for these things. They wanted to use these big computers that would take up whole massive rooms and warehouses, with computing power. There's the whole joke that the power that you hold in your cell phone right now was the same power that they used to fly to the moon back in the 60s. So I don't know if that's exactly 100% accurate, but I would not be surprised. I mean, our phones right now can do some amazing things. So for this foreseeable future, this is in the 50s or so, research institutions were using these simulations, these games, to explore programming, human-computer interaction, computer algorithms, their artificial intelligence. We got games that simulated, these, games like tic-tac-toe type games, checkers, sheeps and gates. I'm not going to explain sheeps and gates. I don't know what it is. I looked into it and I was like, I don't know what this is. I'm not even going to bother. It'd be a while before we got any other meaningful video game to come to the market back then in 1951. So about 7 years later, we got, many of you know this, we got Tennis for Two. And this was a game that was displayed on an oscilloscope and played with two custom aluminum controllers, kind of like knobs. And its visuals show a representation of a tennis court viewed from the side. And players adjusted the angle of their shots with knobs on their controller and try to hit the ball over the net by pressing a button. The history of this is interesting, actually, because the original engineer of the game, who was American physicist William Higginbottom, sounds very British name, but he was American, was the head of the electronics division of the Manhattan Project from 1943 to 1945. If you don't know what the Manhattan Project is, I suggest you look it up. And then he segued into the Brookhaven Project after 1945, when the research focus was used on atomic power for peaceful reasons, not just destruction. At Brookhaven, once a year, though, the facility held an exhibition for the public, with one day each for high school students, another day for college students, and then another day for just the general public. The exhibition largely consisted of tours, static displays, dioramas of stuff, like this is what computers can do for us in the future. And some displays showcased action, so to speak. Hey, this is what this can do. This is what that can do if we can get this to past the creation stage. So for the 1958 exhibition, Higginbottom decided to make an interactive display to just entertain the visitors, just for fun. While reading the instruction manual for one of Brookhaven's computers, which was a Donner Model 30 analog computer, he learned actually that the computer could calculate ballistic missile trajectories, or in this case, a bouncing ball with wind resistance. And he decided to use this ability to form the foundation of a game. And he later recalled his intentions were that it, quote, might liven up the place to have a game that people could play and which could convey the message that our scientific endeavors have relevance for society. Like you can actually use this stuff in society. The device was designed in a few hours, actually, and was assembled over 3 weeks with the help of technician Robert V. Dvorak. And the game was quite popular, not surprising. And an upgraded version was shown the following year, with enhancements including a larger screen and different levels of simulated gravity. I mean, the players could set the game to simulate the gravity levels of the moon, Jupiter, other planets. He referred to the game at this time called Tennis for Two. So it wasn't called that until 1959. And a placard attached to the version was titled actually Computer Tennis. It made more sense, I guess. After the 1959 exhibition, the game was dismantled so that its components could be put to other uses. Once again, didn't know what they had, and just was like, okay, we're done showcasing this. Let's move on. And the game remained virtually unknown until pretty much the late 1970s and early 80s, when Higginbottom was called to testify in court cases for defendants sued by Magnavox over the video game patents of the owner Ralph H. Baer, and we're going to talk about that later because it's kind of it's a dumb story. But I mentioned Ralph Baer, I think, in a previous episode. I think it was when I was talking about the Commodore 64. So if you want a little bit more history on him, you can check out that episode. It's a very, very interesting episode on how the Commodore 64 came to be. So I guess the impetus on why Higginbottom was called into this lawsuit was when people discovered this game, the lawyers for the defense unsuccessfully attempted to have the game declared prior art to invalidate Baer's patents on television and video games, resulting in attention being given to a nearly 20-year-old game as possibly the first video game, quote. And I talk about this because there's the definition of what prior art is. And it's generally defined as anything that is made available or disclosed to the public that might be relevant to a patent's claim before the effective filing date of a patent application for an invention. So this is where you can get into the idea of, if you created a video game based on table tennis, and I'm using this pretty much almost literally to the court case, and you patent this game, table tennis, and someone could say, well, hey, you can't patent that because someone made a game similar to what your patent is years ago. So that makes your patent invalid. So during the time of the Magnavox Odyssey, their patents were under scrutiny because it was potentially thriving off of Tennis for Two's design. And it received further attention as the subjects of articles in Creative Computing and Video Replay in 1982 and 1983, highlighting its possible status as the first video game. And the editor of this magazine, Creative Computing, had played Tennis for Two at Brookhaven in 1958, and he dubbed Higginbottom as the grandfather of video games. However, Higginbottom himself felt that the game was just an obvious extension of the Donner model's, bouncing ball program. Really wasn't worthy of patenting, or he didn't want to consider it to be a large part of his legacy. He preferred to be remembered for everything that he'd done post-World War II for the nuclear non-proliferation work. So it's kind of funny that Ralph Baer is now considered the father of video games, and Higginbottom, unfortunately, to you, buddy, you're considered the grandfather of video games. I know that may not be your first choice, but it's just, it's how history views you, whether you like it or not. So in 1962, a few years later, we got Spacewar with an exclamation point. And this was developed by Steve Russell and many others. It was written for this microcomputer, this mini computer called the DEC PDP-1 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And it was later expanded by other students and employees of universities in this area, including Dan Edwards, Peter Sampson, so many others, so many names attached to this thing. It also spread actually to many of the few dozen installations of the PDP-1s at MIT, making it the very first video game to be played at multiple computer installations. So it's not, just you can only play it here at this display. You can play it at multiple different places. So this is the first, I would say. The game features two spaceships, which was the Needle and the Wedge. That's how they were shaped. One was shaped like a needle, quite literally. Another one shaped kind of like a wedge, like a triangle. Engaged in a dogfight while maneuvering in the gravity well of a star. So the star is in the middle of the screen, and the ships are kind of attracted to it. Both ships are controlled by human players, obviously. Each ship has a limited ammunition and fuel for maneuvering, and the ships remain in motion even when the player is not accelerating. So flying near the star to provide a gravity assist is a common tactic, especially if you want to kind of loop around and stuff. It's kind of cool when you watch gameplay footage of how people can take advantage of that. Ships are destroyed when they collide with a torpedo, the star, or even each other. At any time, the player can engage a hyperspace feature to jump to a new and random location on the screen, though in some versions, each use has an increasing chance of destroying the ship instead, so use at your own risk. The game was initially controlled with console switches on the PDP one, so kind of like a keyboard, though Bob Saunders, one of the original creators of this game, soon built an early gamepad to make it easier to play. And it was a small box, I would say maybe, I mean, you could sit it on your lap, I guess. I don't have the dimensions off the top of my head, but had joysticks on it and a button, a couple buttons that you could control your spaceship during gameplay. And the mechanics of it kind of reminds me of Lunar Lander in its physics. I guess if I could find kind of a comparison to maybe a game that everybody knows now. I mean, you can YouTube this. I'm pretty sure you could even play this somewhere. And the game, was extremely popular in the small programming community in the 60s, and it was public domain. The code was public domain, was widely ported to and recreated on other computer systems at the time. And during the late 60s, we're talking, colleges everywhere were getting computer monitors, companies were getting computer monitors, and, MIT being the forefront of this at this time. Spacewar was inducted into the Video Game Hall of Fame in 2018, which is crazy to think because the Video Game Hall of Fame was initially created in 2015. I think it should have been the first game inducted because I would say it was literally the first wildly accessible video game ever, especially since it was public domain. Like, you didn't have to purchase this. You didn't have to buy this. If you had the code, you could put it in on your monitor, on your computer, and off to the races you go. I mean, don't get me wrong. On the list of 2015, there was Doom. There was A Legend of Zelda. I think there was Tetris on there too. Very iconic games. Don't get me wrong. But to me, I think Spacewar, pretty much hit the ground running, and walked so everybody else could run. So the majority of Spacewar's spread took place several years after that initial development of the game. And there are early anecdotes, and early stories of players and game variants, a handful of locations, because public domain code, you can use it and change it however you want. Most of this, spread kind of spread around MIT, Stanford. It was only after 1967 that computers hooked up to monitors or terminals capable of playing Spacewar began to proliferate, allowing the game to reach a wider audience and influence later video game designers. So this is where computers were leaving the space of corporations and colleges, and now it's like home computers, so to speak. And by 1971, it was estimated that there were over 1,000 computers with this game on it. And it made it so that in 1972, the game being well known enough in the programming community that Rolling Stone magazine had sponsored the Intergalactic Spacewar Olympics. And this event was held on October 19th, 1972 at the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, using a variant of Spacewar on a combined PDP-6, PDP-10, bigger upgrade than the PDP-1 that we got. And the game supported 5 players, which is crazy. It was the first ever video game tournament in history, with an account of it published in the Rolling Stone magazine issue of December 1972. And it's it goes through like, ready or not, computers are coming to the people. That's good news. Maybe the best since psychedelics. It's way off track of the computer's threat or menace school of liberal criticism, but surprisingly in line with the romantic fantasies of the forefathers of the science, such as Norbert Wiener, Warren McCullough, and so many others. I'm not even going to try to Licklider, John von Neumann, and Vannevar Bush. So the trend owes its health to an odd array of influences: the youthful fervor and the firm disestablishmentarianism of freaks who designed computer science, an astonishingly enlightened research program from the very top of the Defense Department, an unexpected market-flanking movement by the manufacturers of small calculating machines, and an irresponsible midnight phenomenon known as Spacewar. Interestingly enough, in the conclusion of this article on Rolling Stone, they actually give you the source code of Spacewar that you can put in so long as you have access to a computer at this time. And one of the interviewers interviewed a guy named Andy Moore, and he said basically all you have to do is read a book on computer programming and you're an instant computer scientist. And it's kind of interesting because getting access to computers wasn't as simple as just going to a store. There was no Best Buy or Walmart or anything like that where you just walk in and buy a computer. They were accessible by big corporations or schools and stuff like that. So it was like trying to convince your school or your university at the time to invest in a computer so that you can just go in. Pretty cool. The controls, I guess he continued for Spacewar are trivial. The simplest way is to go to a radio control store, like for model airplanes, and get the front end of the radio controller, which has 2 sets of joysticks and the pots and everything else. You can use those as inputs to the analog computer. They only cost something like $30 at this time. Once you have the computer on your own, you just put in this code and you're off to the races. So it's kind of crazy. I wonder if you can use this now in maybe C# or C+ or something like that. I don't know. I'm not a computer programmer by any means, but I just wonder how easy it would be to kind of maybe code this yourself. I'm pretty sure it would take you probably a day. So at this time, some people started to look ahead even more and thought this could be a good coin-operated arcade game, actually. It was so easy to program, and like I said, the programming was out there for everybody to use. So in 1971, a prototype coin-operated computer game was created called Galaxy Game with a price tag of $20,000 at this time. In today's numbers, this is $159,000. Pretty expensive arcade cabinet. It featured a PDP-11 monitor, and unfortunately, they never produced more than 2 prototypes at Stanford past this. Around the same time, though, a second prototype coin-operated game based on Spacewar called Computer Space was developed by, you may know this guy, Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, which would become the first commercially sold arcade video game and the first widely available video game of any kind. And this leads us right into Computer Space as the first readily available and mass-produced arcade game. It features a rocket controlled by the player, similar to Spacewar, but now players can engage in missile battles with a pair of hardware-controlled flying saucers set against a starfield background, so it's a little bit more upscale. The goal in this game, in Computer Space, is to score more hits than the enemy spaceships within a set time period, which awards a free round of gameplay. You're not playing against another player, this is a single-player game. The game is enclosed in a custom fiberglass cabinet, which Bushnell designed to look pretty futuristic. It would be hard for me to describe in words, so if you just Google it and look it up, it looks quite unique. There were no knobs on the control panel, there were just buttons. Buttons were fire missile, thrust, and 2 rotate buttons. Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, who designed the game, found a manufacturer for the game, Nutting Associates. Working in partnership with Nutting, the pair completed the game and ran their first location test in August of 1971. A few months prior to the display of a similar prototype called Galaxy Game, which was also based on Spacewar. Like I mentioned earlier, it was first shown to the industry press and distributors at the annual Music Operators of America Expo in October 1971. Very interesting place to showcase it, but it really wasn't, it's not like there was a video game expo at this time. With encouraging initial interest, though, mixed responses from distributors, Nutting just kind of ordered an initial production of 1,500 units, and it anticipated it being quite a hit. So by mid-1972, it had sold over 1,000 cabinets and eventually sold all of the initial production run, probably later on. Unfortunately, it wasn't as successful as they hoped. I think they were hoping to maybe produce some more. And Bushnell left to form Atari right after, alongside with Ted Dabney. And this year we got Pong. And Pong created by Atari, and I'm sure many of you know what Pong is, so I don't need to describe the gameplay mechanics. After forming Atari, Bushnell hired Alan Alcorn to develop the new game for them. He had no experience designing or programming video games at this time, but he knew Bushnell and Dabney very well. I think they worked together in a past company, and they, the both of them trusted him for making something for them. And to acclimate Alcorn to creating games, Bushnell just gave him a project, just like, here, try this out. And this was secretly meant to be a warm-up exercise. So Bushnell told Alcorn that he had a contract with General Electric for a product and asked Alcorn to create a simple game with one moving spot, two paddles, and digits for scorekeeping. He got to work, and after much trial and error, learning, thinking outside the box, he got his prototype up. And how he did this is he used the Hitachi black and white television set that he bought from a local store he bought for $75 at the time, placed it into a 4-foot wooden cabinet, and soldered the wires into boards to create the necessary circuitry. The prototype impressed Bushnell and Dabney so much that they felt it could be a very profitable product and decided to test its marketability. And let's just say earlier testing went very well. And Atari went to work on producing the cabinets themselves. They thought about maybe working with Bally Entertainment or some other manufacturer to manufacture the games for them. But, Atari was like, I think we could make more money if we make this ourselves. And at this time, it was pretty tough to do that. And this is the time when amusement games like pinball and carnival games were associated with the mafia and the mob and degenerate behavior. Can you believe that? Pinball machines. Wells Fargo fortunately stepped in to offer financial backing, and it became such a hit after late 1972 that Atari just couldn't keep up with demand. This hit internationally. I think in 1973, it even, started taking international orders and was a pretty big hit in Japan. So they just couldn't keep up with the orders. And in 72, this was the same year that the Magnavox Odyssey hit the market, which is the world's first home video game console that could be directly plugged into a TV. And in 1951, this is where the story of the Magnavox kind of starts. In 1951, while working for military contractor Loral Electronics, engineer Ralph H. Baer was assigned to build a television set. And Baer later claimed that while doing so, he had this idea to build something into a television set that the owner could control in addition to its normal function of receiving signals just from a remote television station. Laurel didn't really like the idea or pursue the idea, but so Baer kind of left it alone until August of 1966 when he was the head of the equipment design division at military contractor Sanders Associates. He came up with the concept of using a television to play games, and the next morning wrote up a 4-page proposal for a game box. That's what he called it. That would plug into a television screen, and he wanted it to cost around $25 at this time. And equivalent, this is like $250, $260 to today's numbers. So this device would basically transmit a signal that the television set could tune into a television channel, which Baer referred to as Channel LP, which was short for Let's Play. And he described several games that could be played on it. The design went through 7 iterations, different names, different design choices, different technology in them. Baer worked on his off time on this project and even assigned others to do some of the legwork as well on their own time. Pretty bold. The 7th prototype, the final prototype that we got, was named the Brown Box. And this was in January of 1969. The creators of the Brown Box demonstrated the device to company Magnavox because they were trying to find other people. I don't think Saunders was quite interested in developing themselves, so trying to go to a computer company, Magnavox, or TV company. In July of 1969, they presented it to them. Pretty tepid reaction for most of the executives, but Vice President of Magnavox, Gary Martin, was in favor and agreed to produce the console. After a long period of negotiations, the two companies finally signed an agreement in January of 1971. Magnavox named the console initially as the Skillovision, and then just changed it to the Odyssey in September of 1972, which was the release of the system itself. Only at Magnavox stores only. You couldn't just walk in and buy it anywhere. I think it was only available at 18 locations across the country. 13 games were included with the console, which was pretty amazing at the time. Most times you buy a system, you only get 1 game. So this one had 13 games. Others were available to purchase on cartridges. The included games were games like table tennis, ski, Simon Says, hockey, football, many, many more. And oddly enough, this story on the first video game segues into a weird and kind of like dark part of history with lawsuits and legal battles, primarily defining what an electronic game was and who had the rights to them, who had the patents and intellectual properties. And I talked about this earlier with, Higginbottom, with how he was called in for that one of the lawsuits about, tennis for two. So this all started in April of 1974. Magnavox had sued Atari along with several competitors, including Allied Leisure, Bally Midway, and Empire, which was an arcade distributor, for infringing on its patents for video games played on a television screen. Can you believe this? Two more lawsuits joined in by 1975 against Sears, Nutting, Williams Electronics, and others. And Bayer stated that the lawsuits were not filed right away because Magnavox needed to wait until they could expect to be awarded more money than they would cost to pursue the suits. F off, man. The root of the conflict was a set of patents by Bayer and the development team, particularly a pair which described how the Odyssey showed player-controlled objects, or dots, on a video monitor and described the number of games that could be played with the system, which patents were owned by Magnavox. And the judge, in this case, John Grady, ruled in early 1977 that Bayer's patent for the Odyssey constituted, quote, the pioneering patent of the video game art, held the defendants' games as infringing, and set a precedent that any video game where a machine-controlled visual element hit and bounced off a player-controlled element violated the patent. As a result, Atari had to settle in June of 1976, granted it a license in exchange for $1.5 million at the time, which is about $10 to $11 million now in today's money, and access granted to Magnavox to all technology produced by Atari from June 1976 to June 1977. Other defendants paid higher penalties. I couldn't find how much these penalties were, but I imagine for smaller companies, smaller than Atari, this was probably a lot. And like I said, this is where that case for tennis for two came in, because in 1985, that case that Higginbottom was called for, that was because Nintendo sued in an effort to invalidate the patents, claiming as prior art the 1958 tennis for two game built by Mr. Higginbottom. And the court, however, ruled that the oscilloscope-based game did not use video signals and therefore did not qualify as a video game, and ruled again in favor of Magnavox. So it was because of this court case that we got that Tennis for Two was not necessarily considered a video game by Magnavox's word. And even though Magnavox tried to stay relevant throughout history of video games, after they really didn't survive the video game crash in 1983. And of course, Atari just kept going, quick rise to fame with other successful games like Pac-Man and such. And to me, honestly, screw them. Like, we were so close to patents ruined video games at this time. And thankfully, when video games hit more of the mainstream, technology improved. We got better games, better competition. Video games were seen more as a form of amusement that shouldn't be patented, that shouldn't be controlled by, one corporation or one, business, so to speak. So that's really the start of it all. History is not often written by the victors, but ones that were creative, ones that dared, and the ones that just played around, messed around with the technology, especially new technology at this time, thinking, what can we do with this? What can we kind of showcase? One man's fun with a monitor tube over 70 years ago turned into a rich history of video games that we still reap from today. So thanks for listening to this episode, guys. This was kind of an interesting one, an interesting dive into history. So let me know if you like it on my socials on X, Threads, and YouTube at RetroX Podcast. We'll talk to you guys later.